Natural selection. Previously, we discussed the evidence for it, and now we're going to get into the mechanism by which it occurs. So we know that evolution happens. And so we know that evolution happens. It is specifically the change in inherited traits over time. And not only does evolution happen, but we know that it occurs by natural selection. So the traits that are inherited um, are those beneficial traits that are passed down. And the traits that are selected in this case are not chosen by humans, they are chosen by the environment. So, for example, in this population of bacteria, the yellow are those that are not resistant to a particular antibiotic, whereas the ones that are noted in red are those that are resistant to the antibiotic. So, most of them are not resistant to the antibiotic. However, when exposed to the antibiotic, there are most that do die off. Now, the ones that then persist through time are antibiotic resistant bacteria. And so that is natural selection. So, an overuse of antibiotics can lead to the creation of what we call a superbug, which is an antibiotic resistant bacterium. So, we start out with variation within the population, then we lead to the inheritance of a particular trait. And natural selection selects for the best adapted and the most fit. And the adaptation is antibiotic resistance. So Charles Darwin would go on a voyage all around the world aboard the HMS Beagle, and he sailed around the world, around the tip of South Africa, and to the Galapagos Islands. And they are just west of Ecuador, and here they are more up close. And they are an archipelago. And around this archipelago, he observed the beaks of various finches. And aboard his voyage, he posed several questions. For example, why were there no rabbits in Australia despite their presence? Despite the presence of habitats that seem perfect for them? And why are there no kangaroos in England? So he's noticing these various habitats. And in Galapagos Islands, what is specific about this archipelago is that despite the fact that this is around the same latitude, these islands differ in altitude, which gives them a different type of which lends them to different types of vegetation in a relatively small geographic area. Now, among the Galapagos Islands, Darwin noted, for example, that there were various land tortoises, and here are the different tortoises among the Galapagos. So, the Galapagos, again, along, essentially the same line of latitude, differed in terms of altitude amongst the various islands. And because they differed in altitude amongst the various islands, there were different vegetation. On Hood Island here, there was sparse vegetation. And you notice here, for example, that the tortoise has a longer neck. On Isabella Island here, the island had richer vegetation, and here the tortoise has a smaller neck. So you notice that within this smaller geographic region amongst the archipelago, the tortoises varied within their various traits. And it seemed to be correlated with the different vegetations that were on the island. And the one that was on Hood Island had a longer neck to reach vegetation that might have been higher and less numerous. And the one that was on Isabella Island was able to reach the more available vegetation. Even the shape of the tortoise's shell would be valuable in order to identify the type of tortoise. So let me play this regarding the beaks of finches.
Since Darwin's time, the Galapagos Islands have provided a natural biological laboratory in which scientists have studied evolution. Within this archipelago, the small island, Daphne Major, became an important site for the study of the evolution of finches. Like the rest of the islands, the climate of Daphne Major is usually hot and wet from January to May, and cooler and drier the rest of the year. The year 1976 was a typical one for rain. However, in 1977, a small amount of rain fell in January, but then no more rain fell the rest of the year. During this severe drought, the plants withered and many animals died. It wasn't until 1978 that rain returned. The population of medium ground finches on the island suffered severely during the drought. At the beginning of the year, 1,200 medium ground finches lived on the island. By the end of the year, only 180 remained. Medium ground finches with large beaks survived the drought better than others in the population. Before the drought, the finch population had an average beak size of 9.42 millimeters. However, the drought survivors had an average beak size of 9.96 millimeters. Although a 0.5 millimeter difference in beak depth may seem small, it has a huge impact on the ability of a bird to eat seeds. Seeds are an important food source for the finches. In June of 1976, before the drought, an average of 10 grams of seeds were found on a square meter of ground. During the drought, the plants did not produce seeds, so by the next June, only 6 grams of seeds per square meter were left. By December, only 3 grams per square meter were left. As the seeds dwindled in number, their ratios changed as well. In the June before the drought, most of the seeds were small and soft enough for any finch to break open. As the months wore on, most of these easy seeds had been eaten, leaving mostly large, hard seeds. The toughest items on the menu near the end of the drought were the spiky armored tribulus fruits. Only the medium ground finches with the biggest beaks could open these fruits to get the seeds inside. This endeavor took great effort and wasn't always successful. Because large-beaked finches could break open hard seeds, many more large-beaked than small-beaked finches survived the drought. This difference in survival, brought about by environmental pressure, is an example of natural selection. Because a larger proportion of the large-beaked finches survived, they contributed more offspring to future generations. This change in average beak size from one generation to the next is an example of evolution by the mechanism of natural selection. Medium ground finches on Daphne Major have been studied continuously since 1972. As this graph shows, the drought of 1977 had a strong, but temporary, effect on increasing beak sizes. Over time, average beak sizes returned to values similar to those observed at the beginning of the study period. The body size of the birds was also measured for this 30-year period. Body size, which decreased over time, was also subject to bouts of natural selection. Beak shape also changed. The researchers found that over time, the beaks of the birds had changed from a more blunt to a more pointed condition. As this research shows, natural selection can cause traits to vary over time within a species, constantly reshaping a species in an ever-changing world.
So in this video that you just saw, the idea is that more recently in the 1970s, there were differing conditions on the islands that were observed. So this is just over a century after Darwin went, and this is something that we were able to observe. There were environmental conditions that led to a drought, and essentially the beak size of the finches increased. And then there was a land on the Galapagos that there was plentiful rainfall and there were plentiful seeds, and the beak size decreased. So that's essentially a summary of the video that you saw. And that is natural selection in the Galapagos. And now here's a closer look at the finches on the Galapagos Islands here.
Comparison of DNA from the finch species on the Galapagos Islands has confirmed Darwin's hunch about the origins of these birds, that they were descended from a single species from the mainland. All of the finches are descended from a single ancestral form, very likely an insect-eating warbler finch from nearby Ecuador that migrated to the islands between 2 and 3 million years ago. As the members of the ancestral population colonized diverse habitats with varied vegetation, they adapted to local conditions, especially in their eating habits. Sometimes, just the shape of the beak can hint at the diet of a bird. For instance, a lineage of ground finches evolved that specializes in eating seeds. Some of these finches have large, strong bills required to open the hard seeds that they eat. The cactus finch deploys a cactus spine in its tweezers-like beak to pry insects from nooks and crannies. Tree finches use their blunt-ended beaks like pruning shears to snip off vegetation. The short, stubby beak of the vegetarian finch is suited to a diet of buds, flowers, and fruits. Insect eaters include the woodpecker finch. The woodpecker uses tools, holding twigs or cactus spines in its beak to probe for insects. The warbler finches eat small insects and nectar. Finally, a subspecies of the sharp-billed ground finch, the vampire finch, has acquired a taste for blood. The behavior may have evolved from this finch's habit of picking parasites off basking marine iguanas and large seabirds such as blue-footed boobies. Sometimes, usually when food is scarce, the finches will peck at the thin skin on the back of the seabirds and lap up the blood that oozes out.
So what you just saw here
The warbler finch.
is, whoops, it went backwards. But anyway, what you saw there on that slide was you saw a phylogenetic tree of the finches, and you saw how they branch out and how they were all related to each other. And that's what this is. This is a phylogenetic tree. You saw how they were grouped based on their similarities, and this is based on the evidence that Darwin had collected and the fact that they descended from this common ancestor from the South American mainland. And Darwin analyzed the 13 different types of finches that he collected from the Galapagos Islands. For example, this cactus finch has the long pointed beak to get seeds from various cacti. The warbler finch has a thin, sharp beak to spear insects, and this large ground finch has a heavier beak to eat large seeds. So the point is that these beaks are specialized for their food source, and they have a similar structure, yet they have different functions in terms of the seeds that they eat. So you could consider these beaks to be homologous structures. And they do have one common ancestor rather recently. And the you may sometimes see a diagram such as this showing the finches and what their beaks or their bills were used to do and the foods that they eat. And here's a phylogenetic tree showing how they're all related. So Darwin would come back from his voyage and take all of his observations and the papers that he read to formulate his theory of evolution by means of natural selection. Some of the things that he considered, he was influenced by what he knew about artificial selection. For example, pigeon breeding. Pigeons were bred and selected for various features, various colors, even the types of feathers that they had on their feet. And this was accomplished through selective breeding. The same type of breeding, right, we were talking about with dog breeding. Not only was he influenced by his knowledge of this, he was also influenced by what he knew about fossils. So we discussed already about how the lower we are in the fossil layer, the older the fossils, the higher we are in the fossil layer, the younger the fossils. And each one of these is a fossil layer, or what we can say is a stratum, and the plural is strata. We could also use what are called index fossils. So if we notice that there are these various outcrops, perhaps this may be on one continent, one place in North America, here, one place in South America, one place in Africa, one place in Europe, we may be able to relatively date some of the fossils that we see. So, in the green layer that you see, there's what is called an ammonite, and that's this thing here, this here, this here, this here, and this here. If we happen to know the age of that fossil, one, you notice that's in all the outcrops. A second thing is you notice that it's just in that one fossil layer. Third, it's spread out into all the outcrops. But for example, if we find this fossil, we can conclude that it must be younger than the known age of this fossil. Or if we find this fossil, for instance, we may know that this is older than the known fossil age of this fossil. So we can use that to index the age of fossils. So Darwin had a knowledge about fossils, and he was taking that all into account in the formulation of his theory. Darwin also had an understanding of how old the Earth was because these other scientists, Hutton and Lyell, had studied the forces of wind, water, earthquakes, and volcanoes. They had come to the conclusion that Earth is very old and has changed slowly over time due to natural processes, such as plate tectonics, volcanic activity, erosion, and those activities that had occurred slowly over time in the past are still occurring slowly now. And you see these rock layers. This is a process, this is a concept known as uniformitarianism. But just as there is some sort of evolution of Earth and Earth processes, Darwin started to wonder if there was some evolution of biological life, just as there's some change in time of like geological forms. So, is there some change of biological forms? Darwin was also influenced by what he knew about population growth. So this is Malthus. This is him right here. And he was actually an economist. And he made the point that although populations may grow exponentially, resources do not grow exponentially. So resources are limited. And human populations are limited by various conditions like war, disease, food, and there's a point at which that is limited. So Darwin has evidence from the past, fossils. Darwin has the idea that Earth is old. Darwin has the idea that geological forms change, so there's a changing environment. And Darwin has the idea that there are factors that limit populations. So he's also taking what he observed on the Galapagos Islands and he's thinking about how life forms have changed over time. Someone before him, by the name of Lamarck, was one of the first to propose how modern species descend from previous species through the idea of use and disuse. So here are two giraffes who both initially have shorter necks. This giraffe here may never use their neck to reach higher plants. This giraffe may use their neck to reach higher plants. And then the next generation will have those acquired characteristics. This one will not use it or disuse. This one will use it. So that's the idea of use and disuse. This giraffe will inherit that acquired characteristic. And that's what we mean by acquired characteristics. So, although this was a proposed idea of how life changes over time, the mechanism is incorrect, or it's really, I mean, he has a good idea or the right idea, but not necessarily the correct way in which it occurs. It would almost be analogous to our saying, just because you acquire larger than average muscles over the course of your lifetime, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll pass on those larger than average muscles to your children. Or just because you acquire a tan over the course of your lifetime, that you will definitely pass that tan, the tan skin, the darker skin, onto your offspring. It has to start as a genetic trait. So Darwin took these ideas and he published them in his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. The idea that he proposed is that populations evolve over the course of generations through a process of natural selection. Lamarck did not propose that populations change, he saw individuals changing. Evidence presented that the diversity of life arose by common descent through branching pattern of evolution. So, to summarize Darwin's theory, we have variation, we have heritability, we have differing fitness levels, and that leads to adaptation. So, this example here we'll use to outline these 4 points in natural selection. Now, the first one is variation. So if we look at this example here, we see this bird, we see the predator, and the variation in the population of prey, the mice, come from the fact that we have some black mice and some tan mice. I know here I wrote black, white, and tan mice exist. So those may be all variations. Maybe there are some albino mice. That's why I wrote white. But the point is there's variation in the population. That's one element of natural selection, or one tenet of natural selection. A second tenet of natural selection, heritability, is the idea that fur color is genetic and can be passed down. Mutations overall can increase this variation, like the mutation that leads to albinism. So maybe that's white. But if the trait is heritable, that is coded for by a gene. And each gene may have various alleles that help to code for the traits. So perhaps this mouse has a black allele and this mouse has a tan allele. So in this population, there's black and tan alleles. By this point in the population, there's more dark alleles. So an allele is just a copy of a gene. Here the gene is fur color, and there's darker copies of that gene and lighter copies of that gene. But by the end here, you see that there's more copies of the darker gene, or we say darker alleles. So heritability, the most important idea there is that it's a genetic trait. It can be passed down. So as the predator is going over the environment, there's an observed differing fitness. So we see that the mice that camouflage into their environment can avoid predators and can survive to reproduce. The one that has the most kids wins. So we said this previously. And survival without offspring, even though you survive, if you don't pass your traits on to offspring, you have zero fitness. So the ones that are more likely to survive here are the darker mice. And as long as they have offspring, as you see here, they have a higher fitness. So that's where the differing fitness comes in. And that leads to an adaptation, which is the adaptive trait, in this case being darker fur color. It's possible that an organism's fitness can change if its environment changes. So, for example, maybe this is a darker environment because there could have been a volcanic eruption and there was ash here. If there was a lighter sand background in a nearby area, that would lead to the greater advantage for lighter mice. So the idea is that the environment selects for which genetic traits are useful or not. And within the environment, we say that there's two factors. There are the living factors in the environment, such as predators, that may select. And then there are abiotic factors in the environment, such as temperature, that can select. So there's various pressures. So to summarize, and to summarize into natural selection is the idea that the environment selects. So we sometimes hear it today, right, as survival of the fittest. And therefore, those organisms that can survive and reproduce produce individuals with the same advantageous traits. Now, the organisms cannot actively control it. And I illustrated the example with finches. You guys looked at peppered moths. The thing with the mice, those are rock pocket mice. And initially you saw the example with bacteria and antibiotic resistance. So ultimately, a genetic trait that increases the fitness of a population is an adaptation or an adaptive trait. And the increase in the frequency of that genetic trait, right, of that gene, right, with the particular alleles that code for the favorable form of that trait in the population is an example of adaptive evolution. So in the thing that you saw, in the example that you saw, there was the gene for fur color. And in that example, the favorable form was the darker version. So the copy of the gene, the version that was the adaptive trait, was the darker trait. The population has evolved by natural selection to be better adapted to its environment. And just going over it in a little bit more depth, natural selection leads to adaptation and to a population that is dominated by organisms that are anatomically, behaviorally, and physiologically well suited to survive and reproduce in a specific environment. So the idea here is that there's various ways in which they can be adapted to their environment, structurally, internally, behaviorally. Differential survival and reproduction of organisms in a population that have an advantageous heritable trait leads to an increase in the proportion of individuals in the future generations that have that trait and a decrease in the proportion that do not. So to relate back to the previous example, the proportion of darker mice and tan mice changed over time. So there was an increase in the proportion of darker mice and a decrease in the proportion that did not have that favorable trait. So in the tan mice. Adaptation also means that the distribution of traits, genetic traits or allele in a population, can change when conditions change. So going back to that example, although the picture showed a darker background, which might have been in like there might have been ash that was released from a volcano nearby. Maybe if there originally had been a sandy environment, the tan mice might have been favored. We also talked about the peppered moths. So when conditions change during the Industrial Revolution, the trees became darker. So initially, lighter moths might have been favored, but with pollution, darker moths were favored. And then the environment changed again with the Clean Air Act. And when the trees became lighter, lighter moths became more favored. So species become extinct when they no longer survive and reproduce in an altered environment because if members cannot adjust to change that is too fast or drastic, the opportunity for the species evolution is lost. So what's going on now that we see is that environmental change may be happening too fast for evolution to occur where species are able to adapt. We'll get into this more when we get into ecology by the end of the year, but it's thought that we are undergoing a sixth mass extinction that is influenced by human activity. Changes in the physical environment have contributed to the expansion of some species, the emergence of new species, of new distinct species as populations diverge under different conditions, and the decline and sometimes the extinction of some species. And importantly, organisms do not evolve because they want to evolve or because they need to evolve. Evolution happens naturally from changes in genetic traits or alleles. And we will be coming next to talking about how changes in the genetic traits happen over time. But the genetic trait that we were referring to with the mice might have been for fur color. The genetic trait for fur color might have two alleles. One is the dark allele, and one is the light allele. And the proportion of the dark allele in that example increased over time, whereas the proportion of the light allele decreased over time. And we'll get into that more next. But this is where we will end for right now.